Joining us now on the line from Washington, D.C., Colonel Douglas Macgregor. He is retired from the U.S. Army, now president of Glenside Analysis. Colonel Macgregor, good to see you on TVO again. How are you tonight?
Fine, thanks for inviting me.
Not at all. Let's start our conversation in Iraq. What exactly does the Status of Forces Agreement signed by the Americans and the Iraqis entail?
Well, I think to understand what it entails, you have to understand its true meaning. Americans have been told this is a Status of Forces Agreement, but in Arabic, this document is entitled the Agreement on Complete Withdrawal. And I think that really sums it up. For the Arabs, what was important to them in all of these negotiations was to secure our promise that we would get completely out of Iraq.
At the risk of asking a naive question, why would they call it one thing in Arabic and another thing in English?
Well, I'm not sure it's a question of the Arabs calling it two different things. We're the ones that have chosen to call it a Status of Forces Agreement, focusing on some of the provisions regarding what Americans can or cannot do inside the country over the next 3 years, or 3 or 4 years while we're still in the country. But the truth is, this is really about getting us out of their country. You know, for instance, one of the provisions secures our withdrawal from all of their cities and towns next summer in June. That's very important. The Shiite-dominated government of Mr. Maliki wants us completely out of the way so that he can deal with matters on his own terms as he sees fit.
In which case, what do you think this agreement has done to the status of America's troops in Iraq right now?
Well, that's really the thing that most Americans tragically don't understand. This agreement, more than anything else, has really delegitimated the American military occupation and our presence inside the country, period. Remember that our occupation was predicated on the assumption that we were somehow or another going to transform Iraq into a secular democratic state on the Western or American model. In fact, the Iraqi Constitution says that Islam is the inspiration for everything and the foundation of all laws and governance. So this is not a secular country. And despite the lip service we pay to democracy, in reality, a substantial portion of the electorate, mostly Sunnis, Arabs, have been left out. And the various groups, Shiite Arabs and Kurds, have voted along ethnic and tribal lines. So what we have now is a de facto Shiite Arab dictatorship supported by an alliance with the Kurds in the north, largely against the Sunni Arabs, who are the people largely left out of this equation. So what we've got is something very different from what we said we went in to achieve. Now this government, which we established, which is ultimately, in fact, allied with Tehran in Iran, is throwing us out of the country.
And I think I know how you're going to answer this next question, but I'll ask it anyway. Do you think that when the American troops eventually do leave in a couple of years' time, or a few years' time, that the Iraqi army and the Iraqi police are satisfactorily trained, ready to go, ready to assume those responsibilities, all of that kind of thing?
You know, the experience in most of the world, most of the time for the last several hundred years, whenever a European power has intervened in a non-European country, that country's social, political, economic system has reverted to the mean for the region. In other words, once you leave, most of what you established or you thought was important has a habit of vanishing. And what takes its place is whatever is indigenous. You know, the government in Baghdad is very, very closely aligned, ultimately dependent upon, in many respects, Tehran. Mr. Maliki really governs at the pleasure of the Tehran leadership. So I don't think we should expect too much of what's there to remain the same. Now, what will it actually become? How will it be used? It's hard to guess, but most people think that we'll see this so-called Iraqi army and police used against the Sunni Arab insurgents whom we've been essentially paying to cooperate with us and who now regard us as a shield against the Shiite Arab opponent.
Well, let me follow up on that, because I think one of the most interesting things to emerge from the conversation you and I had back in March was this idea that, in fact, United States taxpayers, they were the ones responsible for getting much of the progress in Iraq. It wasn't the surge, but rather you told us it was the fact that taxpayers were bribing Sunnis, in effect, to not shoot at America's soldiers there. These Sunni awakening councils and their salaries were recently placed under Iraqi government control. And I'm wondering how well that transition is working from the U.S. paying them to the Iraqis now paying them.
Well, it's estimated that only about 40 to 50,000 of the so-called former Iraqi Sunni Arab insurgents are currently on the government payroll in Baghdad. The rest we are continuing to pay. The government would not accept responsibility for all 100,000 whom we've been paying hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, frankly speaking, we've paid the leadership millions. The average armed Sunni Arab gets about $10 a day. But under the Iraqi government, his pay's being reduced substantially down to about $2.50 or $3. And quite frankly, the former Sunni insurgents are not happy about it. But I think what they are doing is that they are preparing for what happens when we go. And they're not going to provoke a fight at this point until they feel that they have no alternative, because we've heavily funded the Shiite Arabs as well. This thing called the Iraqi army, which is a majority Shiite Arab force, is now better armed than the insurgents. And I think they reckon that if they provoke it, they will be destroyed by it. This is one of the reasons why they are now hoping that we will not leave. But there's a great deal of discontent over the reduction in salary. And Mr. Maliki repeatedly reminds his countrymen that he will not tolerate these independent Sunni Arab militias.
Well, let me ask you about the departure date, because Barack Obama, as far as I can tell, has not backed away from his commitment to begin the withdrawal in, as he describes it, a safe and responsible fashion. There are many people who are predicting that once the U.S. leaves, all hell will break loose. Are you one of those people as well?
Well, there are different kinds of hells. Let's look at the various hells that have potential to break loose. We've talked about the fight between the Sunni and Shiite Arabs. I think that fight will be short-lived. Remember that we've already presided over the removal of 2 million Arabs from the country who live outside now in refugee camps in Jordan and Syria. They will not come home. There are another 2 million Arabs displaced inside the country. Most of these people are Sunni Arabs. I think the Sunnis will face a choice: either accept second-class citizenship in a Shiite-dominated state or face the consequences and fight. I think most will opt to either leave or just accept the status quo. The really large fight that's brewing is the fight between the Arabs and the Kurds, particularly the Sunni Arabs, but also to some extent the Shiites. The fight centers around Kirkuk and the oil fields in the north, and also Mosul. These two cities, for the last 1,000+ years, have in fact been Kurdish cities. It was Saddam Hussein who forced the removal of Kurds and then settled Arabs in their place. The Kurds want these cities back. And naturally, the Kurds want to control the oil wealth in the north of the country. This is a very serious situation, not simply because of the fighting between the Kurds and the Arabs, which the Kurds will ultimately win, by the way, because they're much, much more adroit soldiers than the Arabs they face, but because this raises once again the possibility of Turkish military intervention. One of the things that the Turkish government and the Turkish armies made clear repeatedly is that they will not tolerate Kurdish control of the oil wealth in the north of the country. Frankly, they're afraid that the Kurds will use the wealth to fund more terrorism against Turkey. So that's a hugely dangerous situation in the north that almost dwarfs the problems between the Shiite Arabs and the Sunni Arabs.
Well, let me follow up on that, because I think maybe some of our viewers might remember that 60 Minutes did a story not that long ago in so-called, what they would like to call Kurdistan, but I guess the Kurdish province of Iraq, in which everything was portrayed as really quite wonderful. It was a self-contained, self-governing, self-regulating, relatively peaceful, relatively prosperous part of Iraq. Are you suggesting that that is much less true today, and in fact looking forward looks even less likely going forward?
Well, the Kurdish areas where the Kurdish population lives have been pacific for many, many years. I mean, long before we intervened, the Kurds were going through a renaissance, if you will, economically. They benefited enormously from the sanctions on Iraq because they were able to bring oil out of Iraq, sell it at good prices to the Syrians, the Turks, and others who then infiltrated the oil out of or exfiltrated the oil out of the area. The Kurds are not going to fight among themselves, at least not for the moment. Most of that is under control. The real battle is just south of Kurdistan in those areas that I mentioned, Mosul and Kirkuk. Those are areas near the oil where the Kurds have always lived. They want those areas back. It would be analogous to essentially suggesting that the southern part of Scotland be turned over to, that had been settled by Englishmen 25, 30 years ago and formerly had always been Scottish, not be given back to Scotland. The Scots would fight for it. The Kurds will fight for those areas. We just don't know what the consequences of that fighting will be. And again, everybody in Iraq is waiting for us to get out of the way. The Sunnis are the ones that are anxious to use us as a shield against their enemies. But everyone else is anxious for us to leave so they can settle these issues.
Well, I've read numerous magazine pieces which suggest, yes, the Iraqi people want the Americans out right away, but when you actually ask them, do you think that would be a good thing? They say, oh, hell no, that would be terrible, but it's got to happen anyway. Can you explain that?
Well, I'm suspicious of those interpretations. I haven't run into very many Arabs, whether they're from Iraq or anywhere else, who don't think that the U.S. military presence in that country is fundamentally illegitimate and needs to end. I think what you're hearing, especially when you talk to the Sunni Arabs, is the notion that we are now a political football. We're seen as something to be exploited. Remember, we're also a cash cow. We've poured billions into this country, and we've created, in many respects, a number of false economies. People are dependent on the cash that comes from the contractors we fund, the installations that we built. So you have some mixed feelings in the Sunni areas about our departure for those reasons, as well as their fear of the Shiite Arabs and the Kurds. But I think it would be a serious mistake for anyone to assume that the Arabs collectively really want us to stay in that country for any length of time.
Okay, let me ask you briefly about two guys who have been, one in the news a lot lately and one not so much. The one not so much is Muqtada al-Sadr, the head of the so-called million-man Mahdi army. We don't hear much about him anymore. How come?
Well, Muqtada al-Sadr has been living under house arrest in the holy city of Qom in Iran. Again, one of the things that people don't understand is that while we were paying the Sunni insurgents to cooperate with us against the al-Qaeda elements who were overwhelmingly foreigners, and they were happy to expel these foreigners from their country, the Iranians had brokered a peace agreement between Muqtada's followers, who are substantial, as you point out, inside the country, and Maliki's government. In the meantime, Maliki, who is swimming in cash at the moment thanks to oil, has also started passing out cash to the Shiites who would otherwise be opposed to him, trying to buy up support. In the meantime, Muqtada al-Sadr sits in Qom. He's still allowed to communicate and talk to his followers, but he is restricted in what he can do. Again, Iran is in charge in Iraq. We are not. The notion that somehow or another we have enormous leverage in that country is very misleading. Iran is the dominant strategic actor now, and in fact, the Kurds have made their peace with Tehran. What they haven't been able to do is secure an agreement with the Turks yet.
The other guy I wanted to ask you about, who has been in the news a lot lately, is Robert Gates, the current defense secretary for George W. Bush, who has agreed to stay on and do the same job for Barack Obama. What do you think of that turn of events?
Well, people inside the Beltway are saying that instead of change we can believe in, which was President Obama's slogan, it's now continuity we can believe in. Mr. Gates, came in at a point in time when people were very disappointed and frustrated with Rumsfeld. Quite frankly, he could have been halfway zipped up in a body bag and outperformed Rumsfeld in the view of most people inside the Beltway. So he's enjoyed a long honeymoon. But the truth of the matter is, he really hasn't done much. He hasn't changed anything. Everything that is going on today was going on under Mr. Rumsfeld. All the extraordinarily expensive and pointless Cold War programs. The $700 billion defense budget has only grown. We haven't seen any significant effort to address that. And when it comes to strategy, if you read Mr. Gates's latest article in Foreign Affairs, he's really all over the map. On the one hand, he says, well, we really aren't going to conduct another operation like the one in Iraq or the one in Afghanistan again. However, we're going to continue to spend billions of dollars to chase so-called insurgents or irregular warriors, presumably Islamist terrorists, all over the world in perpetuity. It's very strange. So I'm not sure we know what he thinks, and right now I don't think we know what President Obama really thinks. And we don't know what will happen after President Obama becomes president. We'll have to wait and see.
Well, indeed, but one thing we know he has said is that while he wants to get out of Iraq, he's in favor of boosting troops in Afghanistan. Do you think that's a good move?
No, I absolutely do not. In fact, if you look at the most recent reports, they're grim. And the question is, what can be done about the situation on the ground? The latest maps I've seen suggest that about 72 to 73% of the country is now either under the influence or increasingly controlled by the Taliban. Controlled in the sense that they're in the territory, they're in great numbers, they are well connected. The Taliban has enjoyed an enormous resurgence in that country, and I don't think people understand why in the United States. It has less to do, quite frankly, with us and a great deal to do with the government in Kabul of Mr. Karzai. Mr. Karzai's government is extraordinarily corrupt and incompetent. Mr. Karzai's own brother is heavily involved in the drug trade, and remember that the heroin production and the drug trade period has increased enormously since Mr. Karzai took control. He and his family have benefited and stolen millions and maybe hundreds of millions of dollars. This is knowledge that is fairly well known across Afghanistan and into Pakistan, so his legitimacy is very much in question. So the real question at this point is, what are we committing additional forces to do? Fighting the Taliban for the sake of fighting the Taliban doesn't make much sense. We need to understand what the purpose is. If the purpose is to boost or bolster Mr. Karzai, then I think that's a very serious mistake indeed.
Meaning that if that's the mission, it's unwinnable? Is that what you're saying?
Well, it's pointless, and pointless missions are usually not winnable. First of all, this notion of winning victory in all of these places in the Islamic world or in most of the non-European world doesn't make any sense. I mean, the best that we can hope for in most cases is damage limitation. We've never understood that. We keep equating what we do today with what we did 60, 70 years ago in World War II. It makes absolutely no sense. The best we can hope for is damage limitation. So the question is, if we are going to commit more forces, what are they going to achieve? The international community is accused of failing because billions of dollars of aid, in aid has not reached the population of Afghanistan. The population is losing faith and confidence in NATO, supposedly. I'm not sure that we ever had much of a chance to ultimately win over a Muslim Afghan population, particularly the Pashtuns, who live in a world that is almost biblical in comparison with the world that you and I live in. Americans and Canadians don't understand just how backward the economy is. And walking into this environment and trying to transform it quickly never had much chance of success.
Well, as long as we're on the Asian subcontinent and we've got a couple of minutes left, let me ask you one more thing. Where do you see the increased tensions between India and Pakistan going in the near run?
Well, if I knew that, I'd probably be a wealthy man. I think that we've reached a point where the tensions are very serious, more serious than people in the United States and Canada and elsewhere probably realize. This could result in another war. Remember, India and Pakistan have already fought 3 wars with each other. And this war that results, while it is provoked in part by what's happened in Mumbai, ultimately is a function of many, many other things that have gone on for decades. This has a great deal to do with Muslim Pakistan and Bangladesh's war with Hindu-dominated India. And this government is a coalition government in New Delhi, and it's weak. And as a weak government, it's trying to figure out how it should respond. It wants to be forceful without necessarily bringing on a war, but it's beginning to wonder what incentive there is to postpone what looks like an inevitable showdown between Pakistan and India. So it's a very dangerous situation. And of course, what happens in Pakistan is inextricably intertwined with what happens in Afghanistan. And if it does result in a war, it could escalate to the nuclear level. And then our forces in Afghanistan, who are already at risk because of their dependence on support from Pakistan, will be at very severe risk.
Colonel Macgregor, I suspect after our 2 conversations, our viewers don't necessarily know if you're right or wrong, but they know you're always candid. So I thank you for that, and we're glad to have you on our airwaves again. Take care.
Thank you for inviting me. Bye-bye.